Continuing my series on World War II tanks that need adding to War Thunder, we now come to Hungarian tanks. Now you might recall that I have previously done a video looking at Hungarian tanks, and since that video we did get the Hungarian subtree added to the Italian tech tree. But there are still many Hungarian World War II tanks that are missing, so hopefully this video will bring a bit of light to these lesser known tanks. Now just some quick background information on Hungarian tank development in the run-up to World War II. Hungary was initially banned from owning or operating tanks in the interwar period by the Treaty of Trianon, as Hungary had been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire that fought as part of the Central Powers alongside Germany in World War I. But in 1920, Hungary managed to secretly obtain 14 German Lk2 light tanks, though due to the Treaty of Trianon, these had to be disassembled and hidden from the Treaty Inspection Committee inspectors. And it wasn't until 1930 and the final withdrawal of these inspectors that 6 of these tanks were finally assembled. From 1928, Hungary would also purchase 5 Italian Fiat 3000 tanks, 3 British Carden Loyd tankettes, and a number of armoured cars, while from 1934 to 1936, 30 Italian CV-33 and 110 CV-35 tankettes would also be brought, giving Hungary a sizable tank force for the time. Unfortunately, all of these tanks were only armed with machine guns, making them unsuitable for adding in-game, and in real life meant they were not well suited to the modern battlefield. Thus, in June 1937, the Huber-1 program would be launched, which led to the first Hungarian-designed tank, the V4. The V4 would be designed by Nicholas Strausler, a Hungarian engineer who is probably most remembered for the creation of the flotation screens for the DD Sherman, which were used in various amphibious operations, most famously the Normandy invasion. But at this point his main products were armoured cars, one of which would be adopted by the Hungarian army as the 39M Csaba, but he also did a little bit of work on a tank named the V3 light tank, which would be developed into the V4. This tank was originally armed with a 37mm gun and was put through trials in a number of countries, such as the UK and Italy, but neither of these nations adopted this tank. Despite this, the Hungarians would be interested in this vehicle, and it would now be re-armed with a 40mm 37/42M length 45 in a turret, giving an in-game penetration of 51mm at 500 metres with its APHE BC shell, or 60mm with its AP BC shell, which is a decent performance in the lower tiers, while 2 machine guns were also carried. Armour was relatively light, however, maxing out at just 26mm, making it vulnerable to most anti-tank weapons, but does provide protection against light machine gun fire. The top speed of the 10-ton tank should be about 28 miles per hour or 46 kilometers an hour, which is pretty good, and to make things better the V4 was capable of amphibious operations, at least when fitted with 2 pontoons, which could be included as an optional modification, giving Hungarian players an amphibious tank in the lower tiers, while 3 crew were to be carried. This would probably work at 1.0 as either the starting tank of the Hungarian subtree, or the second vehicle after the 39M Csaba, giving Hungarian players a useful tank at tier 1, and allowing this unique and often forgotten tank a chance to shine in War Thunder. In real life, the V4 was put through testing, which revealed a few issues, namely that the height to length ratio was too high, giving a high centre of gravity. The nose and tail would dig into the ground when going over hills, the armour was flat-sided with minimal sloping, and it was advised that a loader should be included, which would have brought the crew to 4. At this time Hungary had also acquired a German Panzer I and a Swedish L60, with all 3 tanks tested against each other, and these tests showed that the Panzer I was now obsolete, but plans were made to adopt the L60 as the main Hungarian tank, while the V4 would be the heavy tank with its larger caliber armament. As mentioned, the first prototype would be tested in other nations including Italy, and as I mentioned it wasn't adopted, but a second prototype would be constructed to deal with some of the criticism of the original design. The nose was raised to avoid digging into the ground, and a commander's cupola was added, as well as the turret itself being enlarged, raising the weight of the tank to 12 tons. This could also be added in-game, maybe as a premium at 1.0, giving us an early tier Hungarian premium tank for those who wish to acquire it, while not being massively different to the regular V4. The second V4 prototype would be tested against the L60, but this time the V4 was clearly the loser, with the extra weight increasing the ground pressure, the fighting compartment still being too cramped, and it had a poor ability to climb hills and cross obstacles, while the suspension was also causing a terrible ride which exhausted the crew. Thus, the V4 light tank program would be cancelled, with efforts now focused on adopting the L60. The second prototype would survive, however, still being around in Budapest as late as 1945, and after the Soviet occupation of Hungary, they would take it back to the Soviet Union, with it being scrapped or lost at some point. So the first Hungarian tank design, while showing some promise in some areas, overall hadn't been a great success. So Hungary looked to foreign tanks, and as mentioned, they tested a Panzer I and L60 from the Swedish Landsverk company, with the L60 coming out best in the tests. The Hungarians would acquire a production license for the tank, and after modifications, it would be put into production as the 38M Toldi 1, or A20, and can be identified easily by its circular radio antenna on the right side of the turret. Now, being based on the L60, you might expect it to perform similarly to that vehicle in-game, but this is unfortunately not the case, which you will see from the stats. Starting with the armour, this only maxes out at 13mm for the front and sides, and reduces to 6mm at the rear, making this extremely vulnerable to enemy fire, even from heavy machine guns, though some sloping at the front might help a little bit on that front, but it is generally just a very vulnerable tank. Meanwhile, the top speed is 31 miles per hour or 50 kilometers an hour from a German Bussing NAG L8V 160 horsepower petrol engine, which is a pretty good top speed, and is actually slightly faster than the Swedish L60. Unfortunately, the torsion bar suspension of the Toldi was noted to not be the best, and both the engine and suspension parts were imported from Germany and Sweden respectively, which was an issue in real life when these parts became harder to import after the outbreak of World War II. The Toldi 1 also had a crew of 3, 1 in the hull and 2 in the turret, again much the same as the Swedish L60. So far, this all sounds very similar to the L60, but now we get to the armament, which is drastically different. You see, the L60 in-game has a 37mm gun with a penetration of 41mm at 500 metres with its APHE shell, which is a decent performance all things considered. However, when the Hungarians were deciding on the armament, they instead went with the 20mm Solothurn QF36M, aka the Solothurn S18-100 anti-tank rifle, partly due to this gun being produced domestically, but also because the turret would need to be redesigned. Now, the Solothurn is used on the 39M Charber in-game, and has a penetration of just 25mm at 500 metres, making this useless against many early tier tanks. To top things off, while it has a fire rate of 60 rounds a minute or 1 a second in-game, it fires from a 5-round magazine, and while the reload rate is fairly quick at 3.9 seconds, this is still another limiting factor in this gun's effectiveness. In-game, the Toldi 1 would have to be a 1.0 tank, purely due to its poor armament, while also being at a massive disadvantage compared to the 39M Charber with the same armament, as at least that vehicle has a faster top speed and an extra crew member to mitigate crew losses. Overall, it's easy to see why Gaijin hasn't added this tank, as frankly it would be borderline useless to most players, but I would still like to see it added to War Thunder, even if not as a priority. In real life, 80 Toldi 1s were built by Mavag and Gans between March 1940 and May 1941. However, this was only the first batch of tanks ordered and had relied on imported engines and suspension parts, which not only were now difficult to import due to the outbreak of World War II, but in the case of the suspension were often found to not be up to snuff with regards to quality. Thus, for the next batch of Toldi tanks, it was decided to use domestically produced parts, with this tank becoming the Toldi 2, or B20. Now, for the most part, this is the same as the Toldi 1, though the antenna has been changed from the circular style to a more conventional one, differentiating the two variants visually, but for the most part, its only differences are the use of domestically produced parts. For example, the engine remains the same, but is produced domestically, and the same for the suspension. However, it was noted that the domestically produced suspension parts were of a higher quality to the imported Swedish parts, which might have a very minor impact in game, though I somewhat doubt this will have a noticeable enough difference. I would still like to see this tank in game, however, either with both variants folded or with one being added as an event or premium tank. But again, like with the Toldy one, I can't see this being a popular tank to use in game, so its inclusion would be a very low priority. In real life, 110 Toldy 2s would be built between May 1941 and December 1942, and the Toldy tanks would first be deployed in the occupation of Transylvania in September 1940. After this, Romanian territory was awarded to Hungary in the Second Vienna Awards, while their first combat deployment would be in the invasion of Yugoslavia in April 1941, where mechanical issues soon cropped up. Of course, their next major deployment would be in Operation Barbarossa, with Hungary declaring war on the Soviet Union after the bombing of Kasia, which was done by the Soviets intentionally or accidentally, or as part of a false flag by Germany or Romania. Unfortunately, there's a lot of debate on who actually did the bombing, and here the Toldy tanks struggled, with all of the Italian tankettes lost and 80% of the Toldy tanks. But only 25 were lost from combat, with a whopping 62 suffering mechanical breakdowns. And while these tanks could be fixed, this would take some time due to needing to be sent back to factories in Hungary. It was also seen that the Toldy was now hopelessly obsolete, with its armour all but useless against pretty much any anti-tank weapons, and while its 20mm gun could technically penetrate the armour of older Soviet tanks like the T-26 or BT-7, those tanks in turn could take out the Toldy from a longer range with their superior 45mm guns. And of course the Toldy couldn't do anything against the T-34 or KV tanks. As a result, the Toldy was largely relegated to the reconnaissance role, leaving the Hungarians to rely on tanks supplied by the Germans, with these largely being Panzer 38Ts or smaller numbers of more effective Panzer IIIs and IVs. In light of this, the Hungarians would now look at upgrading the Toldy, which resulted in the Toldy 2A or B40, with a modified turret which was now fitted with a 40mm gun, giving it the ability to fire HE shells and improving its ability to deal with enemy tanks over the 20mm anti-tank rifle. But even with the upgraded gun, it was still unable to deal with the T-34, but it did also have improved frontal armour at 20mm for the frontal hull and 35mm for the turret. Unfortunately for us, the Toldy 2A is already in game, but as a Battle Pass tank, as unfortunately before the Hungarian subtree was added, a number of major Hungarian tanks were added in this fashion. However, luckily for us, there was at least one Toldy 2 that was tested with 5mm side skirts, this usually referred to as the Toldy 2AK. And these side skirts were intended to protect against Soviet anti-tank rifles, but due to providing minimal extra protection while weighing an extra 500 kilograms, these were not adopted for the other Toldy tanks. However, we could in theory get this 2AK variant in the subtree at 1.3 between the 39M Chaba and the Turan 1, giving us an effective Hungarian tank at tier 1, and allowing more players to experience this tank in game. In real life, 80 Toldys were upgraded to this standard, but even with these upgrades, it was still largely used for reconnaissance and anti-partisan operations, as it was still highly vulnerable and still unable to deal with most enemy tanks, and these Toldy 2As would slowly be whittled down by mechanical breakdowns and combat against the Soviets and later the Romanians, who had switched to the Allies in August 1944. And today only one Toldy 2A exists in the Patriot Military Museum in Moscow. So by this point it was clear that the Toldy tank had largely reached the limits of what could be achieved on its chassis, but Gans, one of the companies that was producing the Toldy tank, was still interested in upgrading the Toldy tank, which resulted in the final variant, the Toldy 3 or C40. This was based on the Toldy 2A, but the turret has now been enlarged, as the small size of the turret had been a problem in the Toldy 2A. So this has now been raised and extended further back, giving the crew a little bit of extra room, which could be represented with a slightly faster reload rate perhaps. Unfortunately, the 160 horsepower German Bussing NAG engine has been replaced by a 155 horsepower Hungarian Gans 8 VGT 107 engine, which seems to have been done in an attempt to reduce dependence on Germany, as although the engine was produced in Hungary, it might have still relied on German-supplied components. But unfortunately, this engine change results in the top speed reducing slightly from 29 miles per hour or 47 kilometers an hour to 28 miles per hour or 45 kilometers an hour, as well as increasing the weight to 9.45 tons. This is about the extent of the changes, as although it had been planned to increase the side armour from 13 to 20mm for the hull and 25mm for the turret, due to the increase in weight this would have entailed, this was never carried out. This could probably work at 1.3, maybe as a premium or event tank, as its stats are very similar to the Toldi 2A, and in many cases worse, being slower and slightly heavier, with the only upside being the extra room in the turret, which might give a better reload rate, but it would still be nice to see this tank in War Thunder. In real life, only 2 prototypes were constructed in 1942, and these would be tested from June 1942 to March 1943. And initially an order for 220 tanks was placed, but this was later reduced to 40 and finally to just 12, largely due to the Hungarian army recognising the limited effectiveness of the Toldi tank, while a lack of parts and the bombing of the Gans factory in July 1944 resulted in the halting of tank production. But supposedly 12 incomplete Toldi 3s remained in storage at the factory until the 1950s before being scrapped, which is a fairly long life for a tank that's never actually entered service, and in many ways is much like the L60 that it was based on, as that tank also had a very long life. So the Toldi tank and its variants was about the extent of Hungary's foray into light tanks, but it was also looking at producing a medium tank, and those of you who have watched my Swedish World War II tanks video may recall that the Largo 1 was a tank that the Hungarians were interested in. But they would eventually look at the Czechoslovakian S2C or T21, that was designed by Skoda just before the occupation of Czechoslovakia. Hungary expressed an interest in buying this tank, but with the factories now under German control, they were unwilling to sanction making tanks for Hungarian use. So instead, in August 1940, a production licence was sold for 1.35 million pengos, with the Hungarians putting it into production as the 40M Turan 1, with a few differences to the T21, such as swapping out the 47mm gun for a 40mm gun, installing a new engine and having a 3-man turret instead of a 2-man one, with the Turan prototype finished in July 1941. Of course, the Turan 1 is already in War Thunder, but the early Turans didn't have any side skirts, so perhaps we could have an early and late stage Turan 1, or the ability to remove and add side skirts as a modification, which I think would be a rather welcome addition. In real life, despite purchasing the production licence in August 1940, due to various delays it wouldn't be ordered into production until October 1941, quite a few months into the invasion of the Soviet Union, with one of the reasons being that Hungarian industry initially had issues producing armour of sufficient thickness. Then there were some issues with the engines, as well as other minor issues, but ultimately 285 Turan 1s would be built until 1944. However, because of these delays, the first 12 Turan 1s wouldn't be delivered until May 1942, and even then, all of the Turans built up to that point had to be returned to the factories to fix transmission issues that had cropped up. And ultimately, it wouldn't see combat until 17th of April 1944, during a counterattack against the Soviets in eastern Galicia, nearly 3.5 years after purchasing the licence, and 2.5 years since ordering it for production. By now, the tank was obsolete, with its lacklustre 40mm gun and 50mm of armour, meaning only 2 T-34-85s were destroyed for the loss of 30 Turan 1 and 2 tanks, and we'll be looking at the 2 in a second. Though they did ultimately capture the 2 towns that they were attacking, but the Turan 1 would be whittled down as the war wore on, and none survived today. So the Turan 1 had taken a long while to get into production, and even before the prototype was finished, the Hungarians had recognised that the Turan 1 would need to be upgraded, leading to a set of requirements being set out in May 1941, 2 months before the Turan 1 prototype was even finished, with the new tank to have a 75mm gun capable of penetrating 50mm of armour at 500 metres, a 12.7mm machine gun, a larger turret and thicker armour, though the machine gun requirement ultimately wasn't met. This would ultimately culminate in the 41M Turan 2, which was technically classified as a heavy tank due to the 75mm gun, and we already have this vehicle in game. Though unfortunately, like with the Toldi 2A, this was added as a Battle Pass tank, and is also the only Hungarian World War II era tank that I don't own in game. So again, like with the Turan 1, we could perhaps have a variant without side skirts as a regular tank at 2.3 in a folder with the Turan 1, or between the Turan 1 and Zrínyi 2, as this is a rather important Hungarian tank and definitely deserves to be added in-game. In real life, production wouldn't start until 1942, with the first 4 tanks not leaving the factories until May 1943, and the Turan 2 would see its combat debut in the same battle as the Turan 1, with the Turan 2s responsible for destroying the 2 T-34-85s in that battle with their superior, albeit short-barreled 75mm guns, though as mentioned 30 Turan 1 and 2s were lost to achieve that. But the Turan 2 does seem to have performed far better than the Turan 1 in future battles. That said, only 182 to 188 would be built, so were unable to have a massive effect on the war. And while it was the best tank that the Hungarians had to offer, it was again whittled down by attrition, and today only one exists in Patriot Park in Russia. So the Turan 2 was probably the best Hungarian tank of the war that actually made it into mass production, but there would be a far superior version of the Turan that was around as a prototype, the Turan 3, which would be fitted with a long 75mm gun derived from the German Pak-40, as well as 75mm thick armour and a new turret. Thankfully this is already in game and is an excellent tank, but in theory we could perhaps get the side skirts as an optional modification, which would be nice to have. In real life only one prototype was constructed and was ready for testing by mid-1944, with the gun being a major limiting factor in this, as 3 vehicles were scheduled to use this weapon, but only 2 guns were built at this point, and due to a lack of materials, the bombing of the Weiss Manfred factory, and the cessation of Hungarian tank production in 1944, this project wouldn't go beyond a single prototype. However, the Turan 3 wasn't technically the last Hungarian tank design, as there would be one more, the 44M Taj, which is also the most impressive of Hungarian tank designs, though unfortunately we only have pictures of the scale model to look at, and as you can see it is rather reminiscent of the German Panther tank. So the story of the 44M Taj starts in April 1943, when a Hungarian delegation in Germany was shown the new Tiger and Panther tanks, and tried to buy a license for the Panther, but the Germans asked for a ridiculous amount of money for this license, about 200 million Pengo or 120 million Reichsmarks. Bear in mind the T-21 license only cost 1.35 million Pengo. And this was basically because the Germans didn't want to give the license, instead preferring to have Hungary produce parts for German vehicles, with a portion of German tank production to be shared based on this. Though if the Hungarians were really insistent on buying a license, they were willing to sell one for the Panzer IV. However, the Panzer IV didn't really have any additional benefits over the in-development Turan 3, so this was rejected, and Hungary decided to try and make their own heavy tank, and the Weiss Manfred, or WM, was given the task of designing the new tank. As you can see from this scale model, the 44M Taj was of a very modern design, heavily resembling the Panther with well-sloped frontal armour, with the lower whole front being a whopping 120mm thick, while the large sloped area is 75mm thick, making this very well protected from the front, while the whole sides come in at 50mm, the rear 50 to 100mm, and the whole roof 20mm, again giving pretty good protection. Unfortunately, the turret's armour is a little less certain, but was slated to be 100mm all around and 20mm for the turret roof, which is actually superior to the Panther tank, at least for the flanks. Meanwhile, to move the 36-ton tank, 2 260 horsepower engines from the Turan 1 were combined, giving a combined power of 520 horsepower, which gives a power-to-weight ratio of around 14 tons, similar to the Panther D, and it was supposed to have a top speed of 28 miles per hour or 45 kilometers an hour, though this seems to have been a theoretical top speed, as it was never actually tested. Moving on to the gun, this was initially supposed to be the 80mm 2944M Length 58, which was a modified license-produced version of the Swedish Bofors 80mm Length 48 anti-aircraft gun that was used by Hungary in large numbers. But firing tests with the gun in October 1943 revealed issues that meant production wouldn't start until at least summer 1944. Thus it was decided to go with the 43M 75mm gun, but remember only 2 guns were available at the time and these were being used on the Turan 3 and Zrínyi 1. So the Taj would have to wait for a 3rd gun to be manufactured. Obviously it makes sense that the Hungarians would go for the 75mm gun, as at least that was going to be available, but it would have left the tank rather underarmed compared to what it could have been armed with, having a penetration of 130mm at 500m with its APC-BC shell, compared to the Panther's 173mm at 500m. So it's still useful against many contemporary tanks, but I could see this weapon limiting its effectiveness against some more heavily armoured tanks in game. Meanwhile, two 3440 AM 8mm Gewehr machine guns were to be fitted, one in the coaxial position and one in the bow, though this last one isn't present on the scale model, and 5 crew were carried. In-game, I could see the Taj being added between the Turan 3 and 2S1 Gvozdika at 5.3 or so, as this has in theory better armour than the Panther, while having a less effective gun and being a little bit slower, but this would allow Hungarian players to have access to a Panther analogue, and it would be great for this rather unknown tank to get some love in War Thunder. In real life, the 44M Taj had 2 prototypes ordered, one made of mild steel and one made of armour plate, with the mild steel prototype being mostly finished by July 1944. However, this is about as far as the prototype would get, as to quote from Magyar Warriors, The History of the Royal Hungarian Armed Forces 1919-1945, Volume 1, quote, a complete hull with full running gear, engines and gearbox, and the unfinished welded turret, was destroyed on the 27th of July 1944 during an American air raid, unquote. Now this bombing was rather comprehensive, destroying the factory, machinery, various unfinished tanks, and of course the prototype almost completely, to the point where Weisse Manfred was unable to rebuild the prototype. In fact, the armoured prototype and any remaining parts were handed off to Ganz, who still had some capacity to carry out manufacturing work, but in 1944 the armoured prototype was still unfinished, and in this month Ganz halted all production, so this prototype wasn't finished either. I have to say, of all of the tanks I've covered in my various series, this appears to be the only tank development program that was completely lost due to enemy bombing, outside of maybe a few Japanese prototypes, though in that case it was often that they were destroying documents to prevent their capture after the end of the war. And the 44M Taj is also one of my big what-ifs, as while it would never have made any impact on the war, one wonders how Hungarian tanks would be perceived in the wider world if they had managed to pull off creating their own Panther analogue, and whether it would have performed as well as its designers hoped. So that brings us to the end of Hungarian tanks, but there are still a few Hungarian tank destroyers for us to look at, starting with the Toldi Pansilverdaz, which was a tank destroyer design based on the Toldi 1 light tank. This design first came about after the Germans supplied the Hungarians with 7 Marder II tank destroyers to help replace various combat losses, and one of these was sent to the Hungarian Institute of Military Technology in 1943 so they could have a look at it, and it was quickly decided to see if a Hungarian equivalent could be made, with a prototype duly being constructed. Now, only one photograph of this vehicle exists, but you can see that it broadly resembles the Marder II, with the turret replaced by a fighting compartment containing the main armament, which in this case was a Pak 40 taken from the Marder IIs that had been given to the Hungarians, with this being a decent gun capable of penetrating 135mm at 500m with its APC-BC shell, which is a pretty good performance, although it is unknown if this was the weapon that was to be carried if it went into production, as a Hungarian weapon may well have been preferred if production went ahead. 21 shells would have been carried for the gun, which should be enough for most matches in game, though the ammo rack is in a rather exposed position, but that probably won't make the vehicle that much more vulnerable, as the fighting compartment is open-topped and likely lightly armoured, and regardless the armour of the Toldi 1 only maxes out at 13mm anyway, so this will remain a very vulnerable vehicle. Lastly, the crew is likely to be 3 to 4, and it should have a top speed of 28 mph, 45km/h, which is decent enough for getting around the battlefield. In-game, the Toldi Pansilverdaz could probably be added at around 2.7 to 3.0 between the Zrini 2 and Turan 3, or in a folder, having a better gun and marginally better top speed than the Zrini 2, and it seems like the prototype was either scrapped or reconverted to its original configuration, with only the one photo surviving to show its existence. Though to be honest, I'm kind of surprised that Hungary didn't convert some of its obsolete tanks into more effective tank destroyers, and it kind of showcases the difference between Hungary and Romania, because obviously Hungary was much better at building purpose-built tanks, but I definitely feel like Romania was superior in converting obsolete tanks into far more effective tank destroyers. Of course, the Hungarians would develop other tank destroyers and assault guns, like the Zrínyi II, which started development before the Zrínyi I, confusingly, and this is based on the Turan chassis and is armed with a 105mm howitzer, and somewhat resembles the Stug 3. Now, this vehicle is already in-game, but there were a few different designs of mantlets, with the late variant seemed to be the one that we already have in-game. So we could in theory get an early variant, with it not having the side skirts, which would allow us to have an extra Hungarian assault gun in the regular tech tree, while potentially the soft seal prototype could also be added as an event or premium vehicle. Only 66 to 76 Zrínyi IIs would be completed, with production slowing down due to a lack of materials, and then a large number of them were destroyed when the Weissar Manfred factory was bombed on the 27th of July 1944, but one does still survive in Patriot Park in Moscow. There would also be the 44M Zrínyi I, which began development after the Zrínyi II, and is already in-game, being fitted with the long 43M 75mm gun, as well as two 150mm rocket launchers, carrying 3 rockets each. But this was added as a reward vehicle for the 2022 Summer Quest event, though in theory we could get a variant in the main tree without the rockets if Gaijin so decided to, and in real life it didn't progress beyond a single prototype, largely again due to the delays in producing the 75mm gun. Unfortunately, that's mostly it for Hungarian tank destroyers, with a slight caveat we'll get to later, but you may be surprised to know that Hungary had a lot of rocket-armed vehicles, utilising a domestically designed and built rocket, the 44M Buzogán Veto, or Mace Thrower in English, which began development in 1944 and could penetrate up to 300mm of armour, making this a very deadly weapon, with each launcher carrying 2 of these rockets, with the only major downside being the slow muzzle velocity of just 56 meters a second, making this very hard to use at longer ranges. The Hungarians would mount these on a variety of different chassis, such as the Krupp Protza truck, with the weapon mounted at the rear of the unarmoured truck with a top speed of around 43 miles per hour or 70 kilometers an hour, and a crew of 3 to 4. This would be good as a close-in ambush vehicle, able to park facing away from the enemy, open fire and then quickly speed away, though I can't imagine it will carry a large number of spare rockets for reloads, and any return fire will deal with it rather quickly. But I could see this being a useful vehicle to have somewhere between 4.7 to 5.3, mainly based on the rocket's penetration, though I could also see arguments for it to be far lower on account of the low muzzle velocity of the rockets, making it very hard to use. The 40M Nimrod chassis would also be used to mount the rockets, with this now having some armour, but the Nimrod is based on the Toldi chassis, so the armour is only going to be light at 13mm, mainly protecting against small arms fire, while the fighting compartment is open-topped, though it does have a top speed of 31 miles per hour or 50 kilometers an hour, which might actually be increased by the removal of the turret, and it would be good for getting around less urban maps, while its small silhouette will also help conceal it. Deciding a battle rating for this is also somewhat difficult, but with the rockets now facing forward, it might be easier for players to aim them, assuming the structure the rockets are resting on can be depressed, and this could work at tier 3 or 4 assuming it is not too difficult to aim with, or lower if it is, and definitely much lower if it turns out the structure they're mounted on can't be depressed, otherwise these are going to be used as more indirect fire weapons. Lastly, we have this example of a Toldi 2 fitted with the 44M Buzogán Veto at the rear of the vehicle. There isn't really any information on this vehicle apart from this picture that was taken by an American sergeant in Bavaria, Germany, and this appears to have been a one-off vehicle, but in theory it should be armed with the same 20mm Solothurn anti-tank rifle, given a limited amount of 360-degree anti-tank fire, though again only having a penetration of 25mm at 500 meters, and again the armour is very light at 13mm, while having a decent top speed of 31 miles per hour or 50 kilometers an hour, assuming the rocket system doesn't slow it down too much. However, the main contentious point with adding this vehicle is how exactly the rockets are supposed to be aimed, as they appear to be pointing straight at the turret, meaning they would need a very high elevation and would have to be used almost as mortars to have a chance of hitting anything. Perhaps the mounting point could be elevated above the turret to fire the rockets when in action, or perhaps it was never intended to be fired with the turret and the war ended before the turret could be removed, or maybe it was just fitted for transportation. But I can't see this being added as a regular vehicle, though perhaps it could be added as a 1.0 premium tank, but aside from being an interesting design, I can't see it being useful in-game. So now we can move on to Hungarian anti-air vehicles, and here we get to have a look at a Hungarian vehicle I'm quite surprised hasn't been added, the 40M Nimrod. This vehicle came about from a 1936 deal with Landsverk, where the licence for the Swedish L62 was bought, as well as the licence for the L60 light tank, which would become the Toldi, while an unarmed L62 was received in 1939. The 40M Nimrod would be built on the Toldi chassis, though it was lengthened and widened in order to accept a larger turret ring and a fifth crew member. Like the L62, the Nimrod would be armed with the excellent 40mm Bofors or 36M in Hungarian service, and the Hungarians also had a production licence for this weapon, with these being built by Mavag, with about 932 being built for Hungary, mostly as anti-air guns, though at least 30 were installed on the Hungarian-built Me210CA, and they even built 262 for the Germans, with other nations also buying the gun from Hungary. Indeed, the Bofors would be so influential that the Hungarian anti-tank guns would be converted to 40mm, and all of these fired the same ammunition types. However, despite firing the same ammunition, the Hungarian Bofors should have a muzzle velocity of 850 meters a second, compared to 812 meters a second for the Turan 1's 40mm gun, which using Gaijin's armor calculator should give a point-blank penetration of around 70mm for its APHE shell, and 75 to 80mm for the APBC shell, which is a pretty effective penetration figure, though I do recall comments in the past about the Bofors overperforming in-game, so this might actually be an overestimation of real-life figures. However, the Hungarians were impressed with the Nimrod's anti-tank performance, and in fact, despite being based on an anti-air vehicle, the Nimrod was actually supposed to be primarily a tank hunter, aka a tank destroyer, with its hard-hitting, fast-firing weapon being rather effective against lightly armoured vehicles, which does make sense considering what tanks were available in the late 1930s. Of course, more heavily armoured tanks would be encountered on the Eastern Front, and the 40mm gun was not able to deal with these. So the Nimrod was often fitted with the Stihlgranate 41, as used on the German 37mm guns, this being a single-shot shaped charge capable of penetrating 180mm of armour, and this was fitted over the barrel, meaning when it was fitted you couldn't fire other ammunition types unless you removed the round or fired it. Unfortunately, it only has a muzzle velocity of 110 meters a second, and has to be reloaded from outside the vehicle, which could be represented by having a much longer reload rate when using this shell. Despite the great weapon, the Nimrod is very vulnerable, with the armour maxing out at 13mm, or possibly a little bit thicker for the turret, and it is of course open-topped, making this extremely easy to take out, especially from aircraft. The mobility was okay with a top speed of 31 miles per hour or 50 kilometers an hour, and a crew of 5 to 6 was carried, depending on what source is used. The 40M Nimrod would probably work at either 3.3 between the CM52 and M42 Contrario, giving Hungarian players an excellent anti-air vehicle, able to take out most smaller aircraft with a single hit, while also being lethal against lesser armoured tanks, and it would be nice to see this iconic Hungarian AA vehicle in War Thunder. In real life, 135 Nimrods were built between October 1941 and 1944, though by now it was unable to perform well in its originally envisioned role as a tank destroyer, but it was still an excellent anti-air vehicle right up until the last days of the war. There were other Hungarian AA vehicles, usually based on trucks and usually armed with machine guns or autocannons, but there is also this unusual Rabe V AA vehicle armed with the 0508M 80mm AA gun, which is technically an interwar vehicle and would function more as a tank destroyer, but could work in game at the lower tiers. So that pretty much brings us to the end of Hungarian designed and built tanks, but Hungary of course used a lot of foreign equipment which could in theory be added. Though I would rather avoid copy-pasting where possible, with Hungarian camouflages or skins being offered in most of these cases for vehicles in other tech trees, but these include a large variety of vehicles, starting with the LTVZ-35 or Panzer 35T that Hungary captured from the Czechoslovakian army when they moved in to occupy Carpatho, Ukraine in March 1939. These tanks were damaged when the Hungarians captured them, but they were so impressed by their design that in October 1939 they would invite a representative from Skoda to discuss having these tanks repaired. And it was during these discussions that Hungary would first learn about the T-21, which would of course become the Turan 1. And while a price for repairing these tanks was set at 645,000 koruna, after buying the license for the T-21, Skoda would instead repair the tanks for free, with these returned in September 1940 and kept around until at least 1943 as training tanks. Polish TKS Tankettes and R-35s would also be acquired after the Polish tanks retreated into Hungary to escape the advancing German and Soviet forces. And while the Tankettes wouldn't be suitable for add-in due to only being armed with machine guns, the R-35s could work, albeit they would be hard to use due to their anemic 37mm SA-18 guns, and in real life they would be relegated to anti-partisan missions. In 1942, 15 Hotchkiss tanks and 2 Samura S-35s would also be supplied to Hungary by the Germans, but again these were relegated to anti-partisan missions and would be lost in 1944 after being destroyed by the Soviets. The Hungarians would also naturally receive a large number of German vehicles over many years, including Panzer Is for training purposes, a large number of Panzer 38T F and Gs, or T-38 in Hungarian service, Panzer IIIs, Panzer IV F1, F2s and Hs, R-35s fitted with 47mm guns, Marder II tank destroyers, Stug 3Gs, and Jagdpanzer 38s, as well as at least 5 Panther tanks and, probably most surprising of all, 10 Tiger Is, as the unit that was using them was converted into Tiger IIs, so these could be transferred to the Hungarian army. Unfortunately, while many of these German tanks are good designs and would serve Hungary well, they often weren't around in large enough numbers, while lesser designs were delivered in large numbers. For example, from November 1941 to March 1942, the Germans delivered 102 now obsolete Panzer 38Ts, but only 22 Panzer IV F1s. While after urgent requests for better tanks were sent in July 1942, this resulted in only a further 10 Panzer IIIs, 10 Panzer IV F2s, and 5 Marder IIIs to be sent, nowhere near enough to satisfy Hungarian demands, so the Germans relented and a few months later sent 3 Panzer 38Ts to bolster this force. Hungary would also capture a wide variety of vehicles on the Eastern Front, including T-26s, BT-7s, at least 4 M3 Stuarts that were being used by the Red Army, and at least 1 T-28, as well as a small number of T-34 76s and, I believe, T-34 85s, but these were often damaged and without spare parts, so were really only well suited for use in anti-partisan operations well behind the lines. So Hungary, despite having a limited industrial base compared to the other Axis powers, was the fourth largest producer of tanks amongst the Axis forces during World War II, with some of these designs showing real promise, like the Turan III and Taj, while others like the Turan I and II and Toldi 2A came about too late to make a real difference on the battlefield. And then of course there were tanks like the Toldi 1 and II that could probably be considered fairly obsolete almost from the beginning. Unfortunately for us, however, Hungarian tank development and construction more or less ends in 1944. Basically, Hungary had suffered massive losses during the war, with the Hungarian Second Army being almost completely destroyed around Stalingrad, with 190,000 troops being sent in, and only 40,000 returning, many of these with severe injuries. Suffice to say, the war was becoming less popular, so attempts were made to reach a peace deal with the Allied powers. However, the Germans found out about this and in March 1944 launched Operation Margareta, which entailed the occupation of Hungary to keep them in the war, though its leader Miklos Horthy was kept in power. And, fun fact, he actually held on to his old rank of admiral from when he was part of the Austro-Hungarian Navy, despite Hungary now being a landlocked nation, and he was technically merely the regent, i.e. ruling until the king, King Charles IV, could assume power. But Horthy just kept him away from Hungary to prevent this, making him de facto ruler. Suffice to say, between the Allied bombing, lack of raw materials, massive casualties, the advancing Soviets, the Romanians switching sides, and of course the German occupation and their serious doubts about Hungary's loyalty, all resulted in the more or less halting of Hungarian tank development and production. However, despite the country now being occupied by Germany, Horthy still tried to make peace with the Soviets, and actually signed an armistice with them. But the Germans launched Operation Panzerfaust in response, part of which included kidnapping Horthy's son, before forcing Horthy to renounce the armistice, removing him from power and putting the pro-Nazi Arrow Cross Party in power. keeping Hungary in the war until the very end, even after Hungary itself had fallen to the Soviets. So that brings us to the end of this episode looking at Hungarian World War II tanks, and I'd be interested to hear your views on these tanks and any others you would like me to cover. So for the next episode, I'm hoping to return to the Germans and to finish off their howitzer-based vehicles. Then maybe we'll do another small nation or move straight on to cover some of the more major nations. I haven't quite made up my mind yet, so we'll see how things go. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed the video. I've been Terreno, and I'll see you next time.